Last time we talked about the anarchy and about the rival claims to the throne from Stephen and Matilda, which ended with Matilda's son Henry becoming King Henry II, and about his father being Geoffrey of Anjou. Now, this meant that they were called the Angevin dynasty, but they were better known by their nickname of Plantagenet. And they were called Plantagenets because Geoffrey of Anjou used to wear a plant in his hat. Um, and this name Plantagenet stuck with that family and became the name that the medieval English kings continued to use and to be known by. So we could call this episode the Plantagenets, even though we are talking mainly about the original Plantagenets of England and not the later kings. So Henry II had become the king of England, and he was pretty fucking tough and not to be fucked with. He married a very, very important and powerful woman called Eleanor of Aquitaine, and she was super important and a really interesting woman. She was older than Henry by nearly 20 years, and she had been the Queen of France. She had been married to the King of France, um, Louis the Seventh, um, and she had left him and gone with Henry, and she was the Countess of Aquitaine, which is a very large region in France, and she had a lot of lands in France. Now, Henry had also inherited from his father the lands of Anjou and Maine, which are also quite large areas of France, and he had also inherited from his mother and grandfather Normandy. So a very, very large part of France was now controlled and ruled by the King of England, King Henry, whose empire now stretched from the border of Scotland down to the Pyrenees. He had an excellent wife, and they had an enormous family with more than 10 children. And he was a very, very successful king who Europe looked as someone to be envious of, and whose subjects feared and respected as a great king. The eldest son was also called Henry, and during the reign of Henry the Second, there was quite a lot of trouble with the King of France. The King of France didn't like that the English had more of France than he controlled, and was always trying to see if he could steal some of this land for himself. He also wanted to try to bring Henry down in any way he could, because they were big rivals. Um, Eleanor of Aquitaine was very, very ambitious, and she had a big argument with Henry about the inheritance and who was going to be the king after Henry. Um, she favoured, of course, Henry, the eldest son, and then Richard was the second son, and he was her favourite, and she thought he was fucking brilliant. And but the king's favourite son was John, who was the youngest son, and his mother didn't much like him. Eleanor started arguing with Henry, and she started to rebel against him and to try to overthrow him and put the eldest Henry on the throne. And they had some battles and some fights, and in the end the king actually put his queen in prison and kept her in prison for the rest of his life. Henry, the son, died young, and then Richard and Eleanor and the king were arguing about the inheritance. She favoured Richard, and he wanted John to get it. But when he died, Richard became king. And Richard was nicknamed the Lionheart because he was a real badass and very brave. And but he didn't really like England very much. He preferred France, and he spent most of his time in France. He spoke French, and he hardly ever visited England. And he even said that he would sell London if he could. Now, at the end of Henry II's reign, something happened in the Middle East that was very important. Now I have to rewind a little bit now and talk about something else that happened previously. Now, during the reign of William the Conqueror and his sons, something happened called the First Crusade. And the First Crusade was when several Europeans, including mostly French, but Spanish, Germans, English as well, got together and went to travel to what they called the Holy Lands, which were Jerusalem and the other territories near Jerusalem in modern-day Israel, Palestine, and Lebanon, because those lands had been taken over by Muslims, and the Pope and several Christian leaders didn't like that the Muslims were in these lands, because these lands were, where Jesus lived, and they thought these lands were sacred and holy to the Christians, and so they wanted the Christian people from Europe to travel to the Holy Land and kill the Muslims and retake those lands, especially Jerusalem, and to create Christian kingdoms in them. So that's what they did, and these European Christian leaders went there and they killed the Muslims and they took over those lands, and they created several Christian kingdoms, with Jerusalem being the most important of those, and established themselves in those kingdoms. But towards the end of Henry II's reign in England, something happened in Jerusalem, which was that the Muslims came back in force under a leader called Saladin, and Saladin was a really good military commander, and he defeated the Christian armies in and around Jerusalem, and then he took Jerusalem, and so most of the work that the First Crusade had achieved was now gone, and those lands were back in Muslim hands. And so it was a big shock to a lot of Christians in Europe that they'd lost the Holy Lands. Now, Richard, when he became king, decided that he wanted to go on a crusade, a third crusade, and to retake Jerusalem and the Holy Lands from Saladin. The Third Crusade was started by Pope Innocent III and led by the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. But Frederick Barbarossa died, drowned on his way, and so King Richard the Lionheart got together with the King of France, Philip, and even though they were kind of enemies, there was something strange about the relationship between Richard and Philip, and some people speculate that Richard was a homosexual and that he was gay with Philip of France. But anyway, Philip and Richard decided that they would go and join the Third Crusade and take over the leadership of it together. So they both went together to the Holy Lands, where they fought against Saladin. And Richard was quite a badass and a very formidable warrior, and he was a match for Saladin and defeated him in some battles. However, it was quite difficult to fight in the conditions there, and the Muslims lived nearby, whereas the Christians had to keep traveling long distances to get there. And Richard and Saladin made a deal, basically a peace deal, where Richard had taken some territories and would keep them for the Christians. He would let Saladin keep Jerusalem and some other places, but had to promise to allow Christians to live in them and travel to them without being interfered with or fucked with. So anyway, Richard's priority as king wasn't looking after England, it was to go on this crusade. And while he was on the crusades, his younger brother John was made regent, which meant he was ruling England in his brother's name while his brother was away, like a temporary, stand-in substitute king. Prince John was a bit of a cunt, and there's more on him in the next one. But there was also another brother who had died, though he'd already died, called Geoffrey, and Geoffrey had been a very scheming kind of character, but he died, so he's dead now, so he's not that important. But Geoffrey had a son who was called Arthur, who Richard recognised as his heir, and not John. Anyway, John's running England while Richard's off on the Crusades fighting with Saladin. Everyone's expecting Richard to come home soon because he's made a deal with Saladin and the war is kind of over. Now, while Richard is in the Holy Lands, he's fighting a battle with his friend, the King of France, and on their side is also the King of Austria. The King of Austria isn't as big and powerful as Richard or Philip, and they take over a castle and together, and they all put their flags up on the castle walls, and Richard sees the Austrian flag there, and he says, "Fuck that! They haven't really helped much." So he takes it and throws it in the river and says, "Fuck you, Austria! You're a bunch of dickheads." And the King of Austria is really fucking insulted and pissed off, and he goes home. Anyway, Richard's finished his fighting, and he has to travel back to England, and he goes through Central Europe on his way, and he has to travel through the lands of this Austrian king who doesn't like him. And the Austrian king sort of kidnaps him, captures him, and takes him as a hostage. And he and the new Holy Roman Emperor get together, and they both have some fucking problem against Richard and problem against England. And they put Richard in prison, and they keep him locked up, and they say he's not allowed out of prison until they get loads of money off of England. And it's fucking shitloads of money. It's like a fucking 10 years fucking worth of taxes. It's a fuckload of money. And so they write letters to England, and John reads them, and he goes, "Oh, Richard's in fucking shit, is he? Oh, why do I want to pay loads of money to get him out of prison when I can just keep the money and let him die in prison, and the sooner he dies, the sooner I get to be king." But what happens is their mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, actually manages to get the money together, and she goes eventually, and she gets Richard free. But it has cost England shitloads of money, and it cost her shitloads of money. And also the King of France, Philip, he's taken advantage of the situation with Richard being away to start fucking taking over parts of English lands in France, because John isn't really going to do fuck all about it because he's a bit of a pussy. So anyway, Richard says, right, I'm going to fucking take back all these castles and things that cunt Philip has stolen. I used to be lovers with him, but now I think he's a cunt, and he's taking the piss now, stealing my French lands. I don't give a fuck about England, but my French lands I really care about. So he goes to France, and he starts fighting all these cunts, and he goes to this siege to take over this fucking castle in France. And he doesn't sort of stay out of harm's way. He's riding up and down in front of all his men, right in front of the castle walls on his horse, going, "You're a bunch of cunts, fucking hell, I'm gonna kill you, I'm Richard Lionheart, look at me, I'm fucking brilliant, you're a bunch of cunts." Anyway, some cunt with a crossbow shoots him in the neck, and Richard then dies. And it's a bit of a shit death, really, for Richard. And so John becomes the king, and John is a massive cunt and a prick. And John really isn't really supposed to be king, because Arthur, his nephew, should be king, but John takes the throne anyway. And then there is a war between him and this Arthur, and Philip of France tries to use Arthur to sort of undermine John and to take lands in France. And John has his nephew castrated and blinded out of just a really spiteful kind of torture, and then eventually has him murdered altogether. But there's a lot of fighting between John and Philip of France, and Philip really wipes the floor with John and takes most of the lands off of him, that are in France. You know, like most of Aquitaine and Maine and Anjou, and lands in Normandy, and the territory in France that is owned by and controlled by the English king is really, really diminished and shrinks. And John gets the nickname John Lackland because he hasn't got any fucking land. And John is a real cunt. He's a real bad guy. And we'll leave it there, and we'll continue with John in the next episode, which is about the Magna Carta.